naturally follows. A home market is claimed to be superior because it is alleged to be a server market. Surer market. Producers are less likely to be deprived of it by war and other emergencies. It is moreover urged that it is beneficial especially to the farmer because it saves the expenses of a transportation of products to foreign lands. It has also been maintained by the distinguished American economist Mr. Henry C. Carey that a country can remain permanently prosperous only on condition that what is taken from the soil should be returned in manure and other kinds of fertilizers. And this will be accomplished only when products are consumed at home. Finally, protection has been advocated in the United States, especially since about 1840, when the labor movement began to assume prominence, on the ground that it has been the cause of higher wages in the United States than in European countries, and that is necessary to maintain these high wages, which are said to be one main cause of a higher civilization. Arguments of free traders. It is frequently alleged that protective tariffs are a violation of an assumed natural right of every man to buy his goods where he will and sell his products wherever he sees fit, untrammeled by human laws. The question of natural right has been sufficiently considered elsewhere. It is much to be desired that arguments of this sort should cease to be heard so frequently. It has been claimed that the protective tariffs in the United States are unconstitutional. It would be most unfortunate and anomalous if nowhere in our country were lodged the power to pass such regulations regarding international commerce as it might appear to be required for the promotion of the public welfare. But this argument is idle. It does not correspond to the opinion of best jurists, and it is very certain that we shall never see a Supreme Court in the United States which will venture to pronounce protectionism unconstitutional. Protectionism has been called socialism, but this epithet of malignity is so generally applied to whatever a person incompetent to argue a cause does not like that it will scarcely terrify anyone. The really able arguments of free traders are those which aim to show that protectionism on the one hand fails to accomplish its ends, or it's needless for the accomplishment of the ends it contemplates. On the other hand, actually does accomplish positive harm. It is denied that protectionism is necessary to foster nationalism, and the modern experience parents strong testimony to support this denial. During the past 50 years, international commerce has expanded marvelously, and the international communication has been in every way facilitated. While at the same time we have witnessed a remarkable growth of national feeling all over the civilized world, it is not clear that the protective tariffs are necessarily to produce a diversity of pursuits in a great country like the United States. It is admitted that a purely agricultural nation is not likely to progress rapidly, but it would seem that our enormous extent of country, our varied climate, our natural gifts of all sorts had in themselves amply provided for sufficient diversity, and it is scarcely be maintained that one of the two pursuits, more or fewer, can be of importance. A vast number of pursuits means widely extended division of labor, and this is by no means an unqualified blessing. The argument for protection on the ground that it is a benefit to the wage earner does not seem to the writer conclusive. When this argument is analyzed and answered in the detail, it is seen to involve a discussion of many complex economic problems. One consideration only will be suggested in this place. Labor comes in competition with labor, not directly with commodities. Labor desires commodities, and the more commodities it receives, the better. Now, if it is a desire to protect labor, a tax ought to be put on imported labor, and labor ought thus to be rendered scarce. If this were done, and those who desire labor would be obliged to pay heavily for it, has actually happened in England after the large part of the laboring population. In England, after the Black Death, quote, in the 14th century had killed off a large part of the laboring population. It is desired to benefit labor. It would seem the author has an important importation of labor has been taxed, and labor thus rendered scarce and dear. The importation of such commodities as consumed by wage earners primarily should be encouraged in order that labor might secure an abundance of them cheaply. It is maintained by free traders that protectionism is especially injurious because it diverts industry from a more to less productive channel. It is held that industrial forces, if let alone, will seek those fields which yield largest returns, and that if government artificially induces them to take another direction, the factors of production become less fruitful, and the national economy suffers. It is moreover alleged that protectionism fosters monopolies because it shuts off international competition. Recent combinations of domestic producers, as seen in trusts, which control so large a portion of industrial field, would seem to support this allegation. It is certainly taken for granted that if foreign competition is shut off or lessened, home producers will still compete. That has been one of the fundamental arguments of protectionists. But now we find home producers combining to put an end to home competition. It is scarcely too much call to this abuse of the principle of protection. Some general considerations ought to be kept in mind in tariff discussions. First, its importance exaggerated. We find a country like England prosperous under free trade. We find countries like France and the United States prosperous under protection. It is of real but not of vital importance. Domestic trade exceeds it in its aggregate amount in the United States. Almost immeasurably, foreign trade, the domestic trade of the Mississippi Valley alone, is far greater than our entire foreign commerce. It is much to be desired that other economic questions should be discussed. Second, statistics about the country's prosperity urged either for or against protection are usually presented of no value. The tariff policy of modern countries has been a minor factor in the industrial life. Inventions and discoveries, especially the application of steam to industry and the growth of intelligence, have been the chief forces which have made such an astounding additions to the wealth of the world during the 19th century. Third, bad as it may be in many respects, the American tariffs in a historical growth, and during the century of our national existence, it has taken deep root. It has become part of life, and it cannot suddenly eradicated with impunity. If that is true, the American labor would be better off without it. It does not follow that it ought to be removed suddenly in the interests of American labor, and an industrial growth is abnormal. It is nonetheless true that the adjustment of normal conditions is a painful process. It should be conducted cautiously. Displacements of labor, the capital cost, suffering and loss. At the same time, it is impossible to tolerate permanently bad condition of things, and while rashness is to be deprecated, progress should still be insisted on. Our capital has become enormous. Skill has been developed in our country, and it is not clear that our industrial leaders are not quite capable of holding on to their own with the world in a free market. That fact that the labor receives a large share of the product is, if such is the case, does not render the labor and the other factors of production less fruitful. Does the American farmer abandon the cultivation of land because out of the 100 bushels of wheat grown he must give the American labor, say, 50, while his European rival gives only 30 bushels out of 100? He still has 50 bushels left. This is only part of the subject of protectionism and free trade, a very small part, but it is trusted that it will prove suggestive, and no one will terminate with his tariff studies. It may be said in conclusion that reform of the tariff is possible, but from a protectionist and from a free trade standpoint, one thing is desired in simplicity. In our tariff system, which is now complex, no article should be taxed unless there is some good reason for it. Other things being equal, to the fewer articles taxed, the better. Reductions in duties wherever practicable should be made. Specific duties, that is, duties which are calculated by weight, measurement, or count, is simple and less provocative of temptation, or from the standpoint of honest administration, preferable to ad valorem duties, that is, duties which are a percentage on a value, a thing so hard to be determined. The main disadvantages of specific duties are two, namely, in the first place, they frequently conceal the real amount of the tax. 5 cents on the article does not seem a high tax when mentioned, but if the price of the article is only 5 cents, it is a tax of 100%, which has a very different sound. In the second place, it is not easy in a system of specific duties to tax articles consumed by the rich more heavily than those consumed by the poor. A tax on cloth of 5 cents a yard makes no distinction between cheap and expensive cloth. Of course, silk goods may be taxed more heavily per yard than cotton goods, wine more heavily per gallon than beer, and so on indefinitely. But this is only an approximation to proportionately. We can only say that the specific duties are to be preferred when their peculiar disadvantages do not more than the counterbalance their obvious advantages. Taxes on domestic products are laid usually to raise revenue, rarely, as in the case of liquors and tobacco, to restrict consumption. Such taxes, if too high, produce evasion and adulteration, each more questionable than the normal consumption. Taxes on imports are for revenue to protect, quote, home production. Protection is defined as an encouraging nationalism, diversification of industries and industrial independence, saving transportation, keeping up the soil, and maintaining high wages. It is attacked as contrary to natural light, unconstitutional, and unnecessary either to develop industries or national sentiment. A tax on labor imported would seem to be better protection for American labor than a tax on goods. Protection is said to foster monopoly and pervert the natural course of industrial development. Present tendencies of monopoly indicate an abuse of protectionism. The tariff has been intentionally exaggerated in political discussions. It is deeply rooted here and must be corrected or removed slowly. A reform in the details of our tariff system is needed from the standpoint of either protectionism or free trade. Questions: what two purposes may justify an excise tax, an import tax? What difficulties are there in the way of an excise for restricting consumption? What results are actually accomplished? What is protection? What arguments favor it? How far is each valid? What arguments are urged for free trade? How far is each valid? What is the relative importance of the tariff controversy in politics? What is the value of statistics and tariffs arguments? Why? What objection is there to be a sudden change in the tariff system? What possibly ways are there of protecting labor by taxation? What are the advantages of ad valorem duties or specific duties? The disadvantages of each. Literature. National system of political economy, enable protection work. Tariff history of the United States, the work of fair-minded free trader. Premises of political economy, new view of protection, protection to home industry, a popular presentation, problems of today, argument for tariff reform, state regulation of industry by positive statute. We meet here a mass legislation which it is impossible to examine or even mention in detail in the short space available. It is a result of some of the most stubbornly contested battles in all economic history, but a battle now decided so far as the principle is concerned. We have the non-interference theory promulgated so vigorously by Adam Smith and his followers. The essence of this was the state should let industry alone, that beyond providing the fundamentals and the most general industrial facilities, any interference on the part of the state is productive of more harm than good. There was a profound reliance on the regulative power of competition, which is the balanced equilibrium of self-interest. The mistake of older economists lay in treating it as though it were the only regulative force. The fact is the competition is the only one of a number of forces which balance each other, and if the other forces are removed, competition itself soon disappears. Now, one of the most fundamental and natural forces removed, competition itself soon disappears. Now, one of the most fundamental and natural of these forces is law, the expression of the ethical sense of society through an organ of government. is it natural for men to make laws and try to buy cheap and sell dear? The attempt to regulate industry by competition alone was an attempt to travel on one leg at first, jostle it was necessary to call the other leg into service, or tip over. Labor legislation in behalf of labor was soon found necessary. It became evident the workmen did not by any means move about sufficiently to secure the highest wages. They did not quit. The employer who was careless of their lives and safety. Above all, they did not limit their numbers in a way to prevent a fall of wages. The reason, in plain, we stopped to think of it. Wage earners have families and are attached by many ties to the places where they live. They are poor and cannot move to distant locations. They are ignorant and do not know where better wages are to be had. They are improvident and do not prepare for the future wisely, especially for a future which mostly concerns posterity. In a word, they are incapable of competition on equal terms. Employers, too, do not do as they were expected to. It is for their interest to develop a strong and efficient class of workmen, but they sadly neglect their interest in this regard. It cannot be claimed that employers as a class have taken any considerable precautions to maintain a high standard of efficiency and well-being in workmen, though they wouldn't be better off as a class if they did so. The reason is that their immediate interest is in lowering wages, and they cannot understand a system of fierce competition ignore their immediate interest while seeking to promote ultimate interest. For those who did so would be speedily driven to the wall by those who did not. It is just here that necessarily for law or collective social action appears, namely, to enable men to substitute large and ultimate interests for immediate and destructive ones. It would be unjust to employers to assume they do not care for their employers. The most would be glad to deal more liberally with their men, but few will not, and by their consumption they compel the rest to do as they do or leave the business. This gives a fundamental principle of the utmost importance. Under pure competition, a less scrupulous competitor tends to impose his moral standard upon the rest. An instance of this is found in the case of barbers, who on different occasions in large cities and recently in national convention have resolved to agitate for a law closing barbershops on Sunday. As a class they desire this, but a few will keep their shops open, thus compelling the rest to do so or lose their regular customers upon whom their business depends. Exactly the same need of law appears in connection with wage earners. Without a legal regulation, we may expect a certain result. First, lowering of wages through competition, or what amounts to much the same, a keeping down of wages when generally prosperity is increasing. Second, a substitution of women and children for men in easy employment with a lower wage and farther ultimate reduction in the wages of men. So not infrequently after women and children are employed, the wages of a whole family are no more than the wage of a man before. Third, the destruction of home life and the home economy and the great extension of immorality. Finally, a permanent reduction in the standard of life. The progression is the chief disaster which can befall any people. Laws restricting the employment of women and children. We must insist upon limitation of labor for children, which will allow a sound physical and mental development. Not only are most employments injurious to the health of children, but they all interfere with education, even if we gained in goods by child labor, which on the whole we do not do. We should and must sacrifice this advantage to rather wrong the future citizen and jeopardize the republic, neglecting his education. The case of women in equality imperative. As mothers, they must neglect their children if they work in factories. Infant mortality and disease are the certain result. This is by no means all. It is a mistake to suppose that we are rich simply in proportion to our goods. We are rich also in proportion to the use we make of them. We can expect in homes where parents and children simply come home to sleep. Thrift, neatness, comfort, to say nothing of affection and thousand elements of value in home life and associations can scarcely exist. This empathetically a case where wage earning classes would be richer with fewer goods. What time left to attend the problem of consumption of their income, but goods would not be less. Of course, legislation cannot prohibit female and child labor, but it can and should limit it strictly with a view to the facts here considered. Laws limiting the hours and days of labor. Nothing at first seems more unnatural than to forbid a man's working as long as he likes. This would actually be the case if he worked for himself, but, quote, no man liveth unto himself. It is a demonstrable fact that if small minority of workmen in a community are willing to work 12 hours per day under the competitive system, the rest will have to do so. They probably get no more wages and produce no more goods. They simply live so much less and retard human progress. It is the same as with the barbers. Without law, it takes practically unanimity to carry a point. With law, a majority can do so. The unanimity is possible when a large majority of society favors a change which should rule it on the minority or the minority. We may lay down the following principles in confidence. First, the working days should be limited with difference. Limits for men, women, and children. Sometimes the limit can be established by private combination and legal limitation is not required. It has been observed that in the absence of well-enforced legislation, the working day is apt to be longer in those manufacturing establishments in which women and children are employed than in those in which men are employed, because the latter can combine more effectively. Private combination to effect a reduction of working hours has both limitations and disadvantages. It is not likely to be effective in an occupation unless a considerable degree of skill is required in it, because otherwise it is not possible to bring about common action among nearly all competitors for employment, and as just stated, a small minority can defeat the wishes of a vast majority. It is to be remembered that industrial invention and progress have broken down the barriers between occupation and made it comparatively easy to learn to do new work in a manufactory. Private combination is therefore with less effective than formerly, and may explain the favor with which the legal regulation of the length of the working day is received in a country like England, and the very classes with which a few years since rejected it. Private combination would, in the light of recent strikes in the United States, not seem to be sufficient for employees of vast corporations like our American railway companies. Private combination has its disadvantages because it causes serious loss and strikes which attend it and become it inconveniences and injuries innocent third parties, namely the general public. When the public interest is so great as in its railways, it would seem the only rational course to have public regulation of the hours of labor, establishing a normal working day, and with this public reservation of the peace. It is to be noticed finally that in ordinary manufactories it often appears to be sufficient to establish a normal work day for women, children, and young persons, as when these stop in establishments in which their work is essential, the entire working force must also quit. It is customary in England at present to limit the day only for these three classes named. Second, Sunday labor should be limited to real needs of society. The day is needed for something else than getting a living. Third, employers should be compelled to take due precautions for the safety and health of the employees. Fourth, law should be invoked in those cases where the minority can thwart the purpose of the majority or otherwise seriously injure society. Just how long a working day should be, we cannot here discuss. 10 hours is doubtless a maximum, and there is some reason to believe that an 8-hour day in manufacturers would prove equally productive and can be immense gain to society. Instead of so short a day of labor, a shorter week, allowing a Saturday half holiday, and some decided advantages. This system, which is in vogue in England, is at least worthy of a careful consideration in this country.